Victory over France more than doubled the size of Britain's North American territories. This came at the high cost of stationing 10,000 troops to defend the sprawling American frontier west of the Appalachian Mountains. As a response to this cost, London attempted to shift colonial policy and make colonists shoulder some of the financial burden for their own defense. Though changes like this did not sit well with Americans, revolution was by no means inevitable. For 13 long years, the colonies sought only to claim their rights as Englishmen. This unit is meant to identify how conflicts over economic policies soon exposed irreconcilable differences between Americans and their British counterparts over political principles. By the middle of the 18th century, two fundamental ideas had taken root in the American colonies. First, the idea of republicanism, that citizens would be willing to subordinate or put aside their own private selfish interests for the benefit of the common good. These ideas were popular in the time of the Enlightenment. The success of a republic depended upon people exercising what the Greeks called civic duty. This meant that the citizens had to demonstrate a capacity for selflessness, self-sufficiency, courage or patriotism, and a need to be involved in the welfare of the state, or an appetite for civic involvement. Republicanism was opposed to this hierarchy of authoritarian institutions, such as aristocracy and monarchy. Instead, the notion that the will of the people was the foundation of government was essential to republicanism. The second value that was being born in the colonies in the middle of the 18th century was the sense of the protection of liberty. Colonists feared threats to liberty posed by arbitrary power of the monarch or his ministers. This value was in part shaped by the influence of the radical Whigs, the British political commentators who attacked the king's ministers for their use of patronage and bribery. Corruption was blamed on the ministers' moral decay or their lack of civic duty. Whigs warned citizens to guard against this corruption and conspiracies that would take away from their liberty. Roots of the revolution started with the liberties Americans gained due to their geographic distance from England. Property ownership and political participation were relatively accessible, so Americans had grown accustomed to running their own affairs, especially during the period of salutary neglect. Coupled with the Whigs' values of republicanism and liberty, American colonists were ultra-sensitive to any threats to their rights. Even though the American colonies had been founded by trading companies, religious groups, or land speculators, the Crown practiced a policy called mercantilism, which allowed it to control the economics of the empire. Mercantilism maintained that the power of England was measured by its material wealth. Colonies existed first and foremost to make the mother country rich. They could both supply raw materials, reducing the need for foreign imports, as well as provide guaranteed markets for England's exports. London expected the American colonists to provide raw materials, such as tobacco, sugar, and the timber used to build ship masts. And at the same time, they were expected to import manufactured goods like textiles and furniture from Britain, and to avoid competing markets. The intention of a colony was not to create a self-sufficient, self-governing territory, but instead a unit of interdependence, mostly designed to benefit the motherland. From time to time, Parliament passed laws to regulate the mercantilist system. Most familiar to us at this point were the navigation laws of 1650, over 100 years prior to the American Revolution. The intention of this original mercantilist law was to reduce the influence or competition with Dutch shippers. All commerce flowing to and from the colonies had to be first transported by a British vessel. This would also include colonial vessels, which is why the New England colonies developed such a thriving merchant marine. European goods destined for the American colonies also had to first make a stop in Britain, where a tariff or tax could be collected and the British middlemen or tax collectors could get the profits. While this would institute the triangle of trade, you can also see how this would make goods more expensive in the American colonies than they were in the homeland of England. Additionally, American merchants had to send enumerated products, that is, a specific set of products, most notably tobacco, exclusively to Britain. They were not allowed to trade these products with France or other competing empires, even if prices might be better elsewhere. This allowed the empire to create a monopoly on cash crops. At the same time, the price of manufactured goods versus raw materials created an imbalance between the colonies and Mother England. Since manufactured goods are processed, they already have a marked up price versus their raw material side. But with the markups with taxes, as well as the requirement that all goods, manufactured goods, first be taken to London, it created a situation where there was a cash shortage in the colonies. This situation forced many colonies to issue paper money. Ultimately, Parliament took that power away because colonial currency fluctuated, because it reduced the uniformity amongst trading partners in the empire. And in some cases, it was worth very little. In order to benefit the merchants of Europe, colonial currency was prohibited. This demonstrated the powers of Parliament to nullify or cancel colonial laws. The power to nullify and the royal veto were always controversial and incited colonial anger. Even though they weren't used that often, the notion that the king could step in and cancel the will of the people was a place of contention between the colonies and the homeland. The colonists viewed the mercantilist system as a burden and an annoyance. Tariffs placed on goods being shipped to the colonies stifled economic initiative, and the cash shortages created by restrictions on manufacturing made colonials dependent on British creditors. Ultimately, the mercantilist system made the colonial merchants and planters feel like their economic opportunities were being suppressed and controlled by a parent company, much as the way a teenager feels controlled by them. The realities of mercantilism weren't all negative, however. England ensured the colonies had a market for their goods, and in some cases, as was the case with manufacturing of ship parts, the Crown invested more heavily in American businesses at the expense of British competitors. And as part of the British Empire, American colonists and their business were protected by the strongest navy and military in the world. And this came without any responsibility to pay for it. This image is of Paul Revere, the famed silversmith and horseman, challenged convention of British art. It reflected the new democratic spirit of the age, portraying an average artisan in working clothes as opposed to a noble. Note how Copley, the artist, depicted the serene confidence of the master craftsman and reveres quiet pride in his work. This spirit was starting to evolve amongst many Americans. After the 7 Years' War, Britain held one of the world's largest empires and the biggest debt, 140 million pounds of debt, half of this from defending the American colonies. 10,000 British troops had been stationed in North America following the French and Indian War. But England did not expect the colonies to pay the costs back. Instead, the intention was that Americans should be responsible for paying 1/3 of future defense costs. They did not intend to place a direct tax on the colonies. Instead, they would consider a sales tax adopted by the British Parliament. This would be the first of its kind. Prime Minister George Grenville also ordered the Navy to strictly begin enforcing navigation laws and to crack down on American smugglers. This image is called The Female Combatants and was published in 1776. Britain is symbolized as a lady of fashion and her rebellious daughter, America, as an Indian princess. Their shields of obedience versus liberty seem mutually exclusive as their battle standards. You can see on the shield of liberty a rooster along with a hand. This was the family crest of John Hancock, the renowned merchant and smuggler. A year after adopting the Proclamation Act of 1763, Parliament placed the first tax on the colonies designed to raise revenue for the Crown. This so-called Sugar Act placed a tariff or import tax on all non-British sugar from the West Indies. The funds raised were to go towards colonial defense, while simultaneously cracking down on smuggling and protecting the British West Indies sugar trade from French competition. But the well-meaning laws were the source of much colonial opposition. Parliament was even convinced to reduce the tax by 4 cents, and the uproar died down. Resentment renewed when the Quartering Act, also of 1765, required colonies to provide food and quarters for the British troops stationed in America. The colonists didn't want troops stationed on their town common. They didn't want them in their vacant buildings or in their homes, and they certainly didn't want to pay for them to have new barracks. So, many colonies responded to this by refusing to pay for the construction of barracks. 2 years after the Proclamation Act, the Sugar Act, and the Quartering Act, Parliament enacted one of the more controversial new laws. The Stamp Act of 1765 placed a small tax on paper products, specifically legal and commercial documents, playing cards, and newspapers. The rationale was to create a fund for military defense where the Sugar Act had failed. The Prime Minister, Grenville, regarded these measures as reasonable. In fact, people in England paid higher taxes for the same kinds of products. Unfortunately, this new set of laws pinched the pocketbooks of some of the most defiant members of American society. Attorneys and business people who needed legal documents and paper for their businesses. The playing cards of gamblers and tavern owners, and newspapers of publishers who were quick to vocalize their dissent against this particular set of laws. The act also seemed to jeopardize the basic sense of rights for the English colonists, this idea of self-taxation. More detestable than the taxes was the heightened enforcement of the anti-smuggling laws. Tax collectors and the military could now search ships for unstamped goods without warrants. Smugglers were prosecuted in admiralty courts or military courts without juries, and the concept of innocent until proven guilty seemed to be violated by this notion. If found guilty, the personal possessions of a smuggler could be confiscated and sold by the government. One of Boston's most respected and yet notorious merchant smugglers was none other than the first signer of the Declaration of Independence, John Hancock. Colonists feared these laws were a conspiracy to strip them of their historic liberties. Parliament, on the other hand, couldn't understand why 7.5 million Britons had to pay heavy taxes to protect the colonies, whereas 2 million colonials refused to pay only a third of the cost for their own defense. Americans, however, made the distinction between legislation and taxation. They conceded that Parliament had the right to pass laws related to the entire empire, but they denied the right of Parliament, in which Americans had no voice, to impose taxes on Americans. Referencing back to their colonial charters that granted them the rights of Englishmen, such taxes were seen as robbery and violations of their rights. Only colonial assemblies could tax colonists if Parliament was unwilling to make room for colonial delegates. When Parliament indicated the power to legislate and the power to tax could not be separated, the colonies denied the authority of Parliament altogether and began thinking about their own independence. Please take a look at this list of rights of Englishmen. Through the common law tradition of the English courts, this is a list of expected rights the colonists had. Obviously, the first is no taxation without representation. As we move through this unit, it's important to note, though, that British policy also violated other rights that the colonists expected. For example, protection from unlawful search and seizure without a warrant, the interference of free trade, rights to property, rights to trial by jury, and the notion that one is innocent until proven guilty, not guilty until proven innocent. Colonial protests against the hated Stamp Act took various forms. In 1765, delegates from across the colonies once again met. In this case, the Congress was bigger and more unified than the Albany Congress. The Stamp Act Congress was attended by 27 delegates from 9 different colonies. These men drafted a petition to King George III, in which they stated their rights and grievances as colonists and beseeched the king to repeal the repugnant legislation. In this case, they were acting on their rights as Englishmen to petition. This petition was ignored by England, but again, it was a significant step towards intercolonial unity. Most important to come from the Stamp Act Congress, however, was the non-importation agreements that the delegates adopted. These agreements unified the colonies behind a practice of not importing British goods. This was a promising stride towards union and helped to ignite the American people for the first time in common action. This gave Americans new opportunities to participate in colonial protest. Other forms of colonial protest also cropped up. Women in the colonies participated in what were called spinning bees, a competition to create homemade fabric or homespun using wool as opposed to the professionally made textiles from England. Letters of petition were sent. For example, the Stamp Act Congress's Declaration of Rights, and more notoriously, mob violence. against tax collectors and people that were viewed as responsible for supporting British legislation. Tarring and feathering and the arson against tax collectors' homes chased many tax collectors out of the colonies. Even common household wares in the 1760s testified to the colonists' mounting rage against the Stamp Act. Many people in Britain sympathized with the Americans and sought to profit from their anger, as this English-made teapot demonstrates. Most notorious of these semi-legal protest groups that used mob violence and intimidation to end the Stamp Act were the Sons of Liberty and Daughters of Liberty. These folks took the law into their own hands with cries of liberty, property, and no stamps. Shaken by colonial commotion, the machinery of collecting taxes broke down. By the time the act was actually supposed to go into effect in 1765, all stamp tax agents had been forced to resign. The boycott also hurt the English economy. By this point, the American colonies consumed 25% of British exports. They couldn't afford to lose the colonies, so Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. In the black and white image on this page, you can see Sons of Liberty groups tarring and feathering and beating and even lynching tax collectors. While there's no reports of any tax collectors dying, these near lynchings were meant to send a clear message to the tax collector that they needed to leave town or else. This popular rendering of the punishment of a commissioner of customs, John Macomb, shows him being tarred and feathered and forcibly paid with great quantities of tea. Hot tea was being poured down the throats of tax collectors as a sign of discontent over taxation on tea. From the Liberty Tree in the background dangles the threat of death, a noose, all for attempting to collect duties on tea in Boston. Because of the economic blow protesting dealt to the British economy, the Stamp Act was repealed. Parliament then passed the Declaratory Act, reaffirming its right to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The British government defined its constitutional principle: absolute and unqualified sovereignty or power over the colonies. The stage was set for continuing confrontation as the colonies wanted a measure of their own sovereignty. So it's important to note, while the Crown gave in to the colonial protests over the Stamp Act, they followed this action with a stronger line on their power to enforce laws on the colonies. So in the immediate, colonists were glad to see the Stamp Act go. In fact, grateful New York colonists erected the statue of King George III in the middle of the city. In the long run, however, continued attempts to violate the rights of Englishmen, of the colonists, would lead to revolution. This statue of George III was eventually torn down during the Battle of Long Island, in preparation of the Battle of Long Island, and melted down into musket balls that were then shot at British troops.